Well, hello. So we're going to be doing this lesson pre-recorded due to the construction going on at the church building and some time restraints. Lord willing, we'll be able to get back and have some sort of back and forth for the next few lessons as the building is getting worked on. So look forward to hearing your comments on that. For now, though, if you have any comments, questions, or anything like that for this part of the lesson, feel free to email me, text, call, stop in, whatever you'd like. Before we begin today, I just want to say I've gotten a few comments about how some of this material could be over your heads. Some comments like it just is beyond me or something like that. And I know this is very complex. It is very complex material. This isn't the kind of class that you can go into Sunday morning and come out Sunday afternoon knowing most of it, let alone all of it. When I was going through this, I went over the lessons, the lectures, the books multiple times. Then I went over my notes multiple times, and then went over the PowerPoints multiple times. This is going to take a lot of work to get what you can out of this class. So I just wanted to encourage everybody not to get discouraged. This by no means is an easy class to understand. And that's part of the reason why we're going over it. So today we're going to be talking about space. The truth is out there. So Genesis 1 in verse 14 through 19. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to distinguish between the day and the night. Let them be signs to mark the seasons and days and years. And let them serve as lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. And he made the stars as well. God set these lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth, to preside over the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So we're going to start talking about the sun. So there are a number of things to note about the sun. The first is when it was not there, there was still light. Now, we don't know what that light was. There are a few ideas, a few theories, but nothing of any great certainty. And so for now, we just have to put that up to I don't know. The second thing is that the names used in the passage in Genesis 1 are not sun and moon. It's the greater light and the lesser light. And that's because the common names for the sun, or it could be because the common names of the sun and moon had pagan connotations, just like we think of when we think of a number of stars that were worshipped, or a number of other celestial bodies that were worshipped, Jupiter being a name of the god, and so on. And back in Moses' time, this did have connotations with pagan religions. And that may be why Moses didn't use sun and moon, the Hebrew words for sun and moon. The purposes of the sun, well, partly to divide the night and the day, provide light upon the earth. And our sun is what's called a G2 main sequence star. You can see a little chart there. Now, this is ideal for living creatures, for life. And if you remember from last time, helium, hydrogen, and lithium were the three main components found in stars. Now, others did have heavier elements and do, but our sun has an abundance of lithium. We don't know what this means. We just know this about our sun for now. Maybe one day we'll find that out. And then beyond the text, we know that the heat is also supplied from the sun. That's another purpose because it warms the earth. Now, some characteristics about the sun. While the sun and moon do appear nearly the same, they actually vary in size throughout the year. This was actually surprising to me. The sun can actually vary by about 3% from January to early July. The moon can vary by about 14%, and it all depends upon the rotation, the placement of the earth, and a number of other factors. And this is very difficult to determine with the naked eye, but very easy with pictures. So if you're a person that likes to take various pictures of these celestial bodies, and you can compare them to known objects, you might appear larger or smaller than when you took it last time or something along those lines. So it's just very interesting that there is some variation. Now, even back in Greek times, ancient Greek times, it was known that the sun was the further object, probably because of solar eclipses and the like. But it wasn't until the 1600s that we got the exact distance of the moon. in the 1800s for the distance of the sun. Now, one big problem as far as the sun goes is that it can't have sustained life indefinitely, meaning that there's something called the faint sun paradox. So, based upon our best understanding, the sun is what we call a thermonuclear fusion. That's what fuels the sun, I should say. Now, you don't need to know exactly what thermonuclear fusion is. All you need to know is that basically you have hydrogen turning into helium and potentially other elements, and that produces heat. Remember, the Big Bang model requires helium, hydrogen, and lithium to turn into heavier elements and heavier elements and heavier elements. Now, we're not saying that happens here, but there is some fusion and some merging of those elements. And so that is our best idea of how our sun and the other stars work. Now, if we take this hydrogen to helium, that's going to change the volume and molecular weight of the sun because you're changing the hydrogen into helium. Now, according to the ideal gas law, which you don't need to know, just know that it's a law, so it's can't be changed by natural processes. That would mean that the temperature will go up over time. And as the temperature goes up, the rate of the reaction powering the sun would go up. And so we have everything ramping up as far as heat and production, and it's an exponential curve, as you can see here. We're also going to have buildup of ash and byproduct. Now this, plus the other changes, are going to change the composition of the sun. So it's further going to get hotter and brighter because of this. And so that means that 4.6 billion years ago, when the Earth supposedly began, according to the evolutionary model, the sun would have been 40% dimmer. And 3.5 billion years ago, when life supposedly originated based upon the evolutionary model, the sun would have been 25% dimmer. So this would have reduced the temperature of Earth from the 17 degrees Celsius that it is today. The average temperature is 17 degrees Celsius. Switch those numbers around. It would reduce the temperature of Earth 17 degrees Celsius, and the average temperature of the Earth today is 15 degrees Celsius, meaning that would make the previous average temperature at 3.5 billion years ago as -2 degrees Celsius. And for those Fahrenheit people out there, that's about -28 degrees for the average temperature of the Earth. This would have created a big problem. It's called a snowball Earth, and it's just like it sounds. Basically, the lack of heat would have snowballed into everything being frozen on the Earth or something along those lines. That's not why it's called a snowball. It's called snowball because it's cold outside. So that was supposed to be a pun. A bad one, but a good one. Now, once you have a snowball Earth, it's impossible to get out of it. So no model, not even the evolutionary model, supports this. So to counter this problem, they have to use the greenhouse gases. So they say that the Earth was warmer, even than it is now. And they use greenhouse gases to try and get to that point. Greenhouse gases act like a blanket over the Earth, keeping heat in. So even though the sun, the heater, was producing less heat, because it had a thicker blanket, the Earth was a little bit warmer than it is today, according to the evolutionary model. This has a number of problems, though, because if this occurred, that means the rate of greenhouse gas change and the rate of the change of the sun would have had to have occurred at the same rate over billions and billions of years. And there is no mechanism linking these two. You cannot have two large-scale processes changing at the same rate over billions of years with no connection between them. It's improbable to the point of impossible. So this is a very big problem for the sun being billions of years old. Now let's look at our sun compared to other stars. Most similar G2 stars vary far more than our sun does. And by that, I mean that every 100 years or so, they give off large bursts of radiation. And as you may expect, this is not good for life. That would cause global warming, cooling, dramatic and erratic degrees of weather change. So thankfully, our sun, despite being a G2 star, is very, very stable, unusually stable, which is a good design feature, a good quality for life, and has even led some to wonder if our sun isn't a star. We don't have any other nearby stars that we can do the same test that we do with our sun, so there is that potentiality there, though for now, it's very likely that it is similar to the stars and can be counted among them. But even with that, it is very unique and has a number of aspects that point to design. Well, now we're going to talk about the other stars. So, what were the purposes of the stars? They had a number: to declare God's glory, to divide the day and the night, for signs such as weather, the testimony of God, coming judgment. Seasons. Now, this likely doesn't mean climactic seasons like spring, summer, fall. More likely, it refers to festivals, festival seasons. And if you remember, the Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar. So, in other words, the months. It's a method of timekeeping. In Job, it also mentions it with weather, so potentially even acting as a farmer's almanac. And one thing to note is that the stars mentioned in Genesis don't just include the stars. They also include the planets, the comets, and the other celestial bodies. Basically, anything in the night sky that was a light that was not the sun and moon. Even the name we have for planets today comes from the Greek word wonder, because they were called wandering stars. Now, according to evolutionary theory, it requires stars to form. And that should take a long time, according to the theory. And so they see pictures of gas in various stages, various configurations, and they try to align those in some pattern in order to say, look, this is a star forming. Now, there is no reason why stars couldn't form with the biblical model. None at all. There are a number of other things that form and die. Plants, for one, are a big one that we see every year. So there's no reason why stars couldn't do it as well. The main thing is that we just don't see it. There is no observable star formation. And we see gas in space, and it's very resistant to being compressed into a star. There's magnetic fields, gas pressure, angular momentum, all these things play a role and inhibit it from forming. Now, they try to say that the bursts of other stars, so supernova, will push these gas patterns to the gas clouds to overcome these obstacles, but that still requires stars to make stars. So it wouldn't have allowed the whole process to begin. So it is still a problem, even if their recovery mechanism seems to fit, which it is very suspect. And there's also strong signs of star aging. A Sirius called the Dog Star. It's about 8.6 light years from Earth. It's called the Dog Star. It's prominent in the major Canis Major constellation. It actually is a companion. Actually has a companion star, so it's two stars. Now, Ptolemy, an ancient philosopher, writer, astronomer, wrote about Sirius, and he wrote it as having a red or pink color. Yet today we see this as blue or white. This is a strong sign that the red giant companion that previously dominated the pair has now shrunk down to the dwarf size and is basically invisible. And there's other signs with other stars to show that there is good evidence for rapid aging processes. So while we see no stars forming, we see hundreds each year exploding. Since 2000, we've measured hundreds of supernovae exploding each year. Yet still, we see no new stars forming. This is a major problem for the evolutionary model, but not for the biblical model. Let's talk about some stars in the Bible. The most notable, the most memorable is probably the Christmas star. Yet there is no naturalistic explanation that would fit this description. It's seen floating hovering in the sky over a house. There's some people that try to say it's a comet or overlapping of planets, that it can appear and disappear, and it just does not fit with recorded time as far as the archaeological aspect, and it doesn't fit the behavior that is recorded in the Bible. So most likely this isn't a natural star, but a miraculous supernatural event. Because remember, even in the Greek as well as the Hebrew, the word used meant light in the sky, a heavenly body. It could even mean some sort of miraculous light in there as well, any light in the sky. The second most likely you've seen in the Bible is Pleiades, and this is mentioned in Job. This is also called the Seven Sisters or Subaru. And Taurus is also seen near Pleiades. It's actually Pleiades is on Taurus's shoulder, and this is mentioned 3 times in Scripture with Orion. You can see the constellation there. And a fun fact is that in an ancient cave in France, there's actually a drawing that looks to be of Pleiades on a cave wall, which is just interesting that these constellations have existed since time immemorial. So now, Orion, that's another one that's mentioned in the Bible. I'm sure many of us at least know Orion's belt from some popular movies. It's called Kisiel, I believe, in the Hebrew, and it's mentioned 3 times, again, along with the Pleiades. Kisilium means Orions, means constellation, or translated as constellations in Isaiah 13, and is connected with fool or foolish in Proverbs. Now, this doesn't mean impious fool, but it means imprudent fool. And there have been some rabbis that connect this Orion, the hunter, with Nimrod of Genesis. And then Arcturus, the keeper of the bears, or Big Bear, or Hyades, mentioned in Job 9 and 38. And this is actually why we call the Arctic, because Arctic is bare, so Arctic is bare country, and Antarctic is not bare country. Just a interesting fact there as far as the Greek's word and the Arctic, the keeper of the bears. So these are just a number of constellations mentioned in the Bible. And this just promotes the Bible as accurate to the time, because we don't know when the constellations were created. We have constellations mentioned in Job, one of the oldest books of the Bible. And the constellations, while altered by pagan stories, like I'm sure many of you have heard of Hercules, for example, or a number of other Greek or pagan myths in the constellations, they're actually far older than that. They're older than recorded history. Even the Bible, since the Bible mentions them, the Bible does not say who started them. So they could have even been pre-Noah for all we know. But there are some things in there that are very interesting and that overlap with many biblical narratives. For one, Hercules. Ptolemy called him the kneeler, and the heel is actually over the head of Draco, the snake. This is very interesting that you're going to have somebody with their heel over the head of a snake, which reminds us of the promise in Genesis. And even more shocking is the southern horizon. We see this grouping of constellations. So first we have Aquarius dumping out water. We have fish. We then see this big ship. Now this was later turned into the Argo from Greek mythology, and the back half of it was then used to turn the man into a centaur. So let's rewind it past to before the ancient Greeks and Romans and keep it as a full ship and a man carrying a dead animal. We also have a raven perched over the celestial equator, and that man is carrying a dead animal to an altar. This should remind you of the story of Noah, of the events of Noah after the flood. So when everything had settled down, he came out and he offered a sacrifice to God. And this could be where this grouping of constellations occurred. After the flood, maybe they set up this. But again, we don't know. This does not prove anything, and it's just a very interesting thing that we can see in the constellations of the night sky. Next, we're going to be talking about the moon. Now, this has probably some of the most interesting things as far as design and as far as the history of our Earth. As far as some design features, it is 1/4 the size of Earth, and Earth has a mass about 81 times the mass of the Moon. This is very unusual for moons in our solar system. Most moons in our solar system are much smaller compared to their planets. So this does have an effect on a number of things as far as the interaction between the Earth and the Moon. And just for scale, the Moon is about the size of the USA. And just another fun fact, you can see the remnants of the Apollo 11 on the Moon. So that does put some previous conspiracy theories to rest. And this has helped us as far as judging the distance to the Moon. So some design features. Again, remember from last time, the Earth's axis varies very little, just by a few degrees. And this is partly due to the Moon. The Moon is required to maintain this. It requires a very special orbit around the Sun as well. So these are very fine-tuned processes that allow us to have our seasons and to allow life to flourish in a variety of the climates that we have. Again, required to have a large moon. The tidal systems definitely require a large moon to actually pull on the oceans and mix them. And it also even pulls on the Earth. The Moon actually slows down the Earth by a 16th of a 10,000th of a second every century. So not a lot in the short span. Don't really have to worry about that slowing down your day any, but just an interesting fact. It does pull more so on the Moon, though. And that causes the Moon to accelerate and move further out. So it climbs higher each year by a degree of about 4 centimeters every year. So after a while, the Moon is going to go pretty high and eventually out of our orbit. But that's going to be a while because it's only moving 4 centimeters a year. And then tides shift about 15 minutes a day. Just another little fun fact there. So it's not the same time every day. Now, the Moon's distance, we know within a fraction of the inch. We've measured it with the mirrors on the Moon and lasers. We've calculated it out with ancient eclipses. So we're pretty confident on the historical record of the Moon and where it's at today and how it's changed since then. So the closer the Moon is to the Earth, the faster it will be pulled on and accelerated up. So the closer it is, the more it's going to elevate each year. So it's not going to be a constant 4 centimeters per year. If you go back in time or forward in time, it's going to get faster further back in time. And the further forward we go, it's going to go a slower raising each year. That means the maximum age of the Moon system is less than 1.5 billion years. So according to evolutionary theory, it's existed since the beginning of the Earth, about 4.5 billion years ago. 4.6 billion years ago. At 1 billion years ago, the tides would have been a mile high, which no one believes this. And at 1.4, 1.5 billion years ago, the Moon would have been at the exact same spot as the Earth. Again, no one believes this. So with the life originating 3.5 billion years ago and the Earth being 4.6, the Moon should be the same as the Earth, according to the evolutionary theory. So they have to use a variety of explanations to try and fix this, with the only evidence to support it is that their theory requires it and the Moon's there today. There is otherwise no evidence to support any of these rescue mechanisms that they have to implement. And there are a variety. Yet, according to with the 6,000 year model, the biblical time scale, the Moon has only moved about 755 feet. So relatively short, unless you're the one trying to get to it. So let's talk about the craters. The craters are probably the most notable thing about the Moon today. It's only in recent history that they believe that these were from impacts. Before the 1950s, volcanic eruptions were the thought. But now, most everyone agrees that these are craters, except for a few of the smaller ones. And this does give us a relative history of the Moon. We can see a number of things based upon the overlap of these craters. For one, we can get an order. For two, we can see that some of these craters are sharper than the others, and that gives us an order. So you can see up here, let me see if I can get my mouse working. Nope. There we go. So you can see here, we got a dull one that's being overlapped by a sharp one that is overlapping another sharp one. So we can take and basically do 1, 2, 3. We see a dull one, which must be older than the sharp one, and this one overlaps both. So this one must be the newest. And we can do that with a variety of them and give us some sort of time frame, time scale, a series of events. There are also other things on the moon besides craters. Well, first let me backtrack a little bit. So we can see these highlands here, the large craters there on the top left of the picture. Those were probably created day 4 or during the fall, according to the biblical model. We don't know if they were formed when the moon was formed and God put it on there for decoration, or if they were a sign of judgment. I tend to lean more towards the fall as a sign of judgment, as you will see that this does also play a role in the flood. So the second thing about the moon is we have these large dark areas here. Those are called Marias. They are relatively smooth, they're relatively large, round, and distinct from the rest of the moon. And they have a few craters in them. And this, according to the biblical model, is likely formed during the flood. They have a number of what we call ghost craters in them. Those are the craters, if you can see them here. There's 2 ghost craters. They are visible, but you can tell that they don't look like the other craters. They look like they've been filled in. That's because these Marias are actually basalt, lava flows. So it seems that they have risen up from the surface, potentially from an impact. And then as that was filling and cooling and hardening, other impacts occurred. Now this gives us a very narrow time frame for these impacts to have occurred. And this gives us a very high rate of impact, a very large number of impacts in a short period of time. And this is way too high for the evolutionary time frame. But it fits very well with the biblical time frame, because where we're seeing another high rate of impacts is in the flood sediments. During the flood, we are seeing hundreds of impact craters, large ones, some that the evolutionists tried to claim killed the dinosaurs, which we'll go into that in a few other lectures. But we are seeing a large number of impacts hitting the earth in these flood layers in the year of the flood. So these being the youngest craters on the moon of note and having a similar high impact tends to connect these 2 events as the moon and the flood both having dramatic impacts on them, which means, if that is true, that the flood was not just a global event, but was a solar system-wide event potentially, which does show the wrath of God if that's the case. Now, let's look at some of the other planets in the solar system. So we have a number of different planets. Only 8 on this picture. I'm sorry for those Pluto fans out there. It is officially no longer a planet. But all the planets in our system orbit the sun in the same direction. And speed is such that they are held in their orbits by the force of gravity. Too fast, it would go further out, and too slow, it would fall into the sun. And they do not interfere with each other's orbits. Very, very fine-tuned. Another sign of design. And we have 2 major kinds of planets. The terrestrial or Earth-like, Mercury, Venus, Earth and Mars, all the rock planets. And the Jovian or Jupiter-like, the gas giants, you might say. Now, all of these have rings, even the ones that we can't see in this picture here. All of them have rings: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And they're all low density, meaning that they mainly have hydrogen and helium in them. But while we call them gas giants, they likely have a liquid center, not a gas base. So there is likely some liquid, most likely not solid though, not rock. And all of these bodies have a magnetic field. Now, we're going to mention Earth's magnetic field here, just because it's one of these planets. And we've been able to measure it for about 180 years since we've been able to measure the magnetic field. and it is decaying. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Everyone agrees that it is decaying. This means that it should not have lasted billions of years. So, evolutionists have to have a recharging mechanism. Now, there's no evidence for this, and it does require two things. It requires a very specific rotation of the planet and a Earth-like core. So this isn't that big of a problem for the other terrestrial planets, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. It can still be used for those planets because those planets, their magnetic fields also can have existed for very long. Yet, the other planet magnetic fields, they still haven't existed for very long. And not only that, Jupiter's is too strong. So we could not exist on Jupiter for a number of reasons, one being the magnetic field. Yet, if it is still existing there for billions of years, how is it so strong? If these magnetic fields are consistent with the biblical timescale, and if they try to use the recharging mechanism for these planets, remember, these do not have the same kind of core that the Earth does. They don't have a solid core. They don't have rock. They have liquid water. And not all of these planets rotate the same way. They all orbit around the sun the same, but they don't all rotate the same. And so that planet wouldn't work double fold. Now, I did want to mention that Dr. Russ Humphreys actually predicted the magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune based upon the biblical age of 6,000 years, meaning before we knew this information, he was able to calculate it out accurately for two planets in our solar system before we were able to measure it based upon the biblical model. This is strong evidence to support the biblical model as being accurate. And again, not relying on the recharging mechanism because it would have given a different answer even if they tried to utilize it for these planets. Another thing that is interesting about these planets, especially Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune, is they give off twice as much energy as they receive from the sun. That's a lot of energy. But where is all this heat coming from? Some try to say that it's from tidal flexing. And you can see a little image of that there at the bottom right, how basically something is working on the planet, on the celestial body, squeezing it and pulling on it in just such a way to create friction and thus create heat. But these are large planets. Nothing that large is going to be working on them. And it obviously can't be primordial heat from their creation, from their beginning, because they're billions of years old, according to the evolutionary model. So they can't accept that. We can't have radioactive decay be supplying this heat because they're not dense enough. There can't be enough radioactive material that is usually quite dense to produce the energy needed. Some try to say something called gravitational settling, but still it requires relatively short time frames for it to be functioning to supply this heat, so it still wouldn't fit with our time frame. So officially, this is a mystery. Yet, it's not a mystery for a short 6,000 year existence of the universe, of the solar system. And it's not just the planets. There's this moon for Jupiter called Io. It is probably one of the most interesting moons in the solar system, minus our own. And I'm not just saying that because I'm from Earth. So this moon has no impact craters, very much unlike our moon. The only solid body in our system to do so. And that's because it's incredibly volcanically active. It is resurfaced, recovered with fresh material very, very fast. You can even see in the top right picture there, on the top of that blue colored moon, that is Io, just the shape and the shadow, causing it to look that way. The little blue on top is actually an eruption that large, visible from space. And that's not volcanic rock. That's not lava. That is molten sulfur, brimstone. This is quite literally a planet of fire or a moon of fire and brimstone. There's a lot of heat here. And you can't say that this is radioactive decay because it's not dense enough. So some people even try to say that that's no moon. No, I'm just kidding. It actually, no one says that. But they do try to say that it's tidal fluxing. So tidal fluxing, remember, is a large mass pulling and pushing on an object, squeezing and creating that friction and thereby producing heat. You can see some images of tidal fluxing of the moon on Earth on the right here. Now, there are a number of problems with this. One, its orbit doesn't really promote this around Jupiter. It's not bobbing up and down, so even Jupiter's bulge wouldn't really affect it that much. Other satellites can't work on it either. So it really is a mystery where all this heat from Io is occurring. So that means it must be primordial. We've ruled out all the other potential explanations for this. Again, taking us back to a recent creation. Now let's go to everybody's favorite non-planet, Pluto. It is 1/400th the size of Earth. Very, very small. It's now classified as a dwarf planet, but not a full planet yet. So it is very, very smooth. There's very few craters on this, which is very unexpected, evolutionarily speaking, which means it must have been reworked sometime in the past. Yet, according to evolutionary theory, this should have a number of craters on it from when it was formed. And it's surprising that it has been reworked recently because where's the heat? It requires a lot of heat to rework an entire dwarf planet even. Not huge, but still requires a lot of heat. There are no other bodies out there, no other celestial bodies out there that can work on Pluto. It's all alone. And it's so very far from the sun that definitely can't be supplying any heat. It should have cooled off relatively quickly, and it should have no heat to resurface itself like this. So why so smooth? Signs of it being young. That is the only way that this heat could have been used to resurface, is if it was because Pluto is young. It's younger than it looks. No, it looks young, I should say. So Jovian rings. That means every Jovian planet, every gas giant does have rings. Saturn is probably the most notable, and that's because its rings are so huge. They are thousands or tens of thousands of miles wide. Yet they're not that thick. They're only about hundreds of meters thick. So they're relatively thin comparatively, though very, very wide. And they're made of numerous small particles. As you can see here on that computer-generated image, that's what it may appear like in the top right corner. There's even room in between the rings. And so they're not a solid connection sideways either. Now, according to the evolutionary theory, how they formed was that a moon or some other celestial rock got too close. It got too close to Saturn's gravitational field, passed the Roche limit, and was just disintegrated by the gravity there. Just pulled apart in every which way, forming these rings in its orbit around. Now, rings have a very, very short life. They're not going to last very long. Just a few 100,000 years, I believe, maybe less at the most. Yet, that's not long enough for these to have been there since their creation. So that means it's all of the Jovian planets have had a moon crash into them within the same time frame as to have all of them still have their rings. This is, again, very coincidental. I've said it probably, I don't know how many times, improbable to the point of impossible. The theory of evolution requires numerous coincidences to even have a chance of being remotely close to fit. And even then, there are still a number of other problems, as we talked about with the heat. There is no mechanism for those. So I just want to make sure you guys know that there are a number of things, even in our study of astronomy, that point to a young solar system. But let's look a little bit further out. So just 2 quick points here. One, comets. There are two kinds of comets, the ones that live longer and the ones that live shorter. And they each come from a different place, the Kuiper Belt and the Oort Cloud. Now, I say that they come there, but really I mean the evolutionary argument requires them from coming from these places. Yet we have no evidence of these places. So at the most, the longest age comets can only last for about 100,000 years. Yet we see numerous of them, numerous amounts of them. So that then begs the question, how do we have so many if we have no way of producing them? So they have to get these places here that we have no evidence for to say that, oh, look, they come from here. Just because they're required to have it for their model because they exist. And that's all the evidence they have, is that it's required for their model and they exist today. Again, another thing that points to a young creation. Spiral galaxies. We live in a spiral galaxy called the Milky Way, but we see many others spiral galaxies. And no, neither of these are pictures of the Milky Way. So galaxies twist themselves tighter and tighter. That's just how their momentum is going to take them. Eventually, if left long enough, it will get to the point where we cannot distinguish the arms from the rest of the galaxy. It's going to be a big old mess if left to go long enough. And I mean over billions of years. Their arms just couldn't last that long. Their arms also contain blue stars. Again, don't last long. So how did these two things that aren't supposed to last long not only are visible, but so prominent? Everywhere we look, we see spiral galaxies. There's so many of them. So they have to create something called the density wave hypothesis. Yet this actually creates more problems than it solves. It says that there's these big waves of force that go through that basically regather these arms and keep them visible, keep them formed by destroying stars and reforming stars. The big problem with that is that the magnetic fields are actually aligned with these arms. We can tell that the magnetic fields are still there, not at a random other point. The wave hypothesis, the density wave, would not affect the magnetic fields. So even with their rescue devices, it creates a number of other problems. So they have no way of making these things last billions and billions of years. Much more likely that they are young. Now, this has gotten into one of the biggest questions as far as the young Earth creation model. And that is the question of starlight and distances. How can things that are so far away, how can we see their light? And I'd like to answer that question tonight, but unfortunately we're out of time. So Lord willing, you can join us with the next class and we can go over that in detail. Again, thank you for any comments or questions that you've brought to me. I hope that this has been encouraging, and please go over the material. It is very in-depth, and if you have any questions when you're going over it, please let me know. I'm always here to help. I love talking about this stuff. Some people may even say too much, but what can I say? Thank you.